Sharks off Cape Cod. In years past, sightings have been, well, amusing, not much of a concern. This year, however, that's all changed. 2 humans have been attacked this summer by great white sharks, and in one case, sadly, ending in a fatality. It leads me to ask what's going on here. And here to provide us some of the answers, we hope, is Tony Lacasse. He is a spokesman for the New England Aquarium in Boston. Tony, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for inviting me.
Sharks have always been around the North Atlantic. I mean, this is not a big surprise. And in the last few years, we've had more sightings in and around the Cape. Is that right?
Yeah, you're right. We've got the Northwest Atlantic, the area that, let's say, from Long Island up through New England and the Maritime provinces in Canada, has always had a small great white shark population. But it's always been fairly dispersed. And there just really wasn't a big concentration of their preferred meal, which is a seal, or on the West Coast, let's say a sea lion. And so historically, we know through most of the 20th century, when you, let's say, did an autopsy on a shark, a white shark that came up, the thing that you would see is that most often it usually probably had been feeding on a whale carcass. And when we see evidence of that actually a lot this past summer, even because we've had so many whales that have been dying due to unknown reasons, and oftentimes sharks play an important role there in terms of sort of cleaning up the mess. In the case, the other thing that's happened is we've also had many more, much greater ability to detect where sharks are. So that's part of it. Some of that is just the universality of cell phones everywhere. But the other one is we're more aware of it because of a lot of the work that's been done by the state in terms of being able to have more shark tagging, more receivers, and so we're aware of that as well. But there's no doubt we probably have had a slight increase in the number of white sharks, but they're more concentrated now because we've got their preferred food in a high density along the outer Cape, mostly in the Chatham area and also in the Truro area.
And so it's simply the seals that are bringing them closer to shore? Is that what we're talking about here?
For the most part, with any wildlife, a lot of their movement is really dictated by the availability of food. So if their preferred food is in one particular spot, you're going to be having a greater concentration of animals there. So in this particular case, what's happened is that gray seals, which were really pretty much wiped out from the region from about, let's say, probably the mid-1600s, all the way through to the late 20th century. They were one of the 2 resident seal species in the region. We often associate the harbor seal as sort of almost in some ways it's like a symbol of maritime New England. They are in much lower densities in terms of they aren't in large groups. Gray seals they like big sandy beaches. They'll haul out in large numbers in an area, and so what happened is that gray seals slowly started to come back in the 1970s and 80s. So what had happened is that seals were actually could be sort of killed on site in Massachusetts. There was a bounty available on them. And then what happened in 1972? You had the federal passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which protected whales, but all marine mammals, whether that was walruses or whether that was seals or porpoises or dolphins. All of them were officially protected under that act. So then what happened is that gray seals migrated in from Canada, and probably the best way to describe the increase in population is their preferred pupping area is an island off of Nantucket called Muskeget. And in the late 1980s, when the state agencies started going out and started surveying the number of pups born there, usually there were a few dozen on Muskeget. Now that number can be in excess of a couple thousand. And that pupping area, most of that pupping happens in January. Surprisingly, gray seal moms only nurse their young for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they're on their own. And so we've had a dispersal of those gray seals throughout, at first, mostly the Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge. That's the big island that's off the elbow of Cape Cod that has been a national wildlife refuge for decades. one of its primary purposes originally was to protect all kinds of migrating birds in terms of there. And then we've had an extension up to Chatham. Those seals have also established a summer residence in the near Truro, North Truro line as well, where there's a smaller colony of them there. So what happened is that it took about a decade for, in some ways, sort of the message to get out in the white shark community that they're there. And the primary way that was done is mostly on an olfactory basis, the smell ability. And so what happened is that sharks, as we all know, have really they've got two exceptional senses compared to people. They have really great smell ability that's, very comparable to dogs in terms of its detectability. And then they also have electroreception capabilities in terms of being able to pick up electromagnetic pulses from other live animals. And so in this case, it took a while for both the smell of all that seal, just the bodily fluids of seals to get out, and then over time, everybody, a lot of that population has learned that there is their preferred meal in that space. Like most large predators, you'd probably prefer to eat a fresh meal than a dead meal, and just the way we prefer, a fresh steak to a frozen steak. And so they're in that area, and they're feeding, though they'll still feed opportunistically on dead whales as well.
All right, so we've had 2 attacks on humans, 1 fatality, as we mentioned earlier. Usually, when you read about something like this, it hasn't happened around here per se, or very, very seldom. It's in other parts of the country, perhaps. But now it's happened here. Is it simply because humans are careless and get near the seals or swim near the seals, or what's prompting these incidents? And I know I don't know if you're a wildlife expert per se, but is there anything you can tell us about that?
Sure. Probably the number one thing. So number one is that shark fatalities worldwide are pretty rare. On average, we have about 6 a year. And in the U.S., we had the death the weekend before last in Wellfleet was the first one in the U.S. since 2016. And so they're pretty rare events in terms of actual fatalities. They're always going to be a product of where you see a lot of people in the water and where you have resident sharks. So an example, the hot spot in the U.S. In terms of the number of shark attacks would be in Florida, because you've got people in the water year-round, and you have, literally hundreds of millions of people in terms of all the tourism there that happens to be there. There are also a lot of different shark species in that area. So that's usually going to be, Florida usually accounts for a third to 40% of the shark attacks listed in the U.S. So that's the thing that's happened on the Outer Cape, is what we've seen is that we've got a lot of people in the water for a short period of time each year. And then we also have had an increase in terms of sharks being closer to shore because of the proximity of seals there. So that's really the formula that's now happened, where we hadn't seen a shark death in New England since 1936, and that actually was a sad event that actually happened in Mattapoisett, in your backyard. Mm-hmm. And it was a young teenager from Dorchester who was down visiting for the day, and it's believed from the descriptions that he probably was bitten by a white shark, though it could have been possibly another large shark species. And when you read the reports on that, I think that there would have been a much better chance of him surviving today, just because of emergency services that we have and that type of thing. So the thing that usually people die of in a shark attack is blood loss. And so if you're swimming far out, or if you're not accompanied by somebody, if you've got blood loss and you pass out, that's when you might die. That's where, if you've got delayed emergency response, that increases that likelihood.
You're listening to Townsquare Sunday. My guest is Tony Lacasse of New England Aquarium. Tony, no one really wants to talk about this next topic, but there are 2 concerns. People want to talk about safety, I'm sure, but the second is the economic impact on Cape Cod and the image that this creates, and it's not a great image for a place that relies on tourism, and the businesses relying on tourism. I'm not sure there's that there's any going to be any decline in the number of people visiting Cape Cod, but I suppose there could be at some point. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a good question that we could probably ask people at the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce and other places. Obviously, you want to be able to offer people a unique recreational and natural experience that they're going to be safe doing. I think, though, strangely enough, actually, in some ways, Chatham has become the white shark capital of the East Coast. And they've actually seen increases in the amount of their tourism, and you now have seal watching boats that go out, about a half a dozen to a dozen operations at various times a year. There's been a lot of orientation for that. In some ways, they've differentiated themselves in terms of versus a lot of other places on the East Coast. I think the thing that is an awareness on the part of people is that this is a tragic event that's happened, but we can also reduce the risk considerably. And if you also take a look in Florida, that has not affected tourism significantly, where you're going to have incidents in Florida that are always going to be you're probably going to have 30 to 40 times the number of shark-related incidents in a year than you will in Massachusetts. And so it is the kind of thing that it doesn't necessarily affect it differently. I think a thing that's different about the Outer Cape is the thing to keep in mind that the Cape Cod National Seashore is a national park. And so, an example, when we've all, sometimes done those trips of a lifetime out west to the Northern Rockies, and we go visit Glacier National Park or Yellowstone, it's the kind of thing that we go there because we know that we have the opportunity to see, big predators and all kinds of animals in a natural setting that's a park setting. And so in the case of those bears, it's grizzlies and wolves and a variety of different animals. And here on the National Seashore, I think you've seen the same thing happen by sort of default, where you've had that restoration of a big ecosystem there. And I think the thing that's the trade-off is that we sort of grew up where on the National Seashore where it was like we could sort of blissfully, do whatever we wanted in the water there when we were growing up. And I think now it's going to take more awareness to do that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
There is, we're going to talk about solutions in a moment, but for us human beings here, we have to be a little smarter about all this. Greg Scommel of the Mass Division of Mass Fisheries, he told this to CBS Boston. In the short term, we can't change the behavior of seals. We can't change the behavior of the sharks. The only thing we can do is change our own behavior. And that means being a little smarter about all this and, understanding that there is a danger, however small it might be, and you got to be careful.
Yeah, I think he's on to something there. And actually, the national park system has dealt with managing millions of visitors, tens of millions of visitors in proximity to large predators for decades. As a young man, I worked as a firefighter in Montana and Idaho. And in the 1970s, there were a couple deaths due to grizzlies in Glacier National Park. And one of the things that they realized there was that they had to that it was easier to manage people than it was to try to manage the bears. So number one, I think we would probably back up. People probably have a memory of, let's say, black bears being fed at Yellowstone back in the 60s and 70s when you had the open dumps. Clearly, that was the behavior they wanted to change, in terms of interactions with people, and we had created the nuisance there. And so they shut down those dumps and did that. But in the cases of these deaths for the grizzlies in Montana, they were backcountry hikers who were killed. And so one of the things that they did is they realized that they could that there were certain times a year that the grizzlies would potentially be more dangerous. They did a lot of education on the part of backpackers. They closed trails at certain times of years. They made hikers aware of how to make themselves more visible to the grizzlies, so you didn't have those circumstances where you're hiking down a trail and all of a sudden you're separating a bear mother from her cubs. And so, of course, just like human mothers would if they perceive a threat, they're going to attack, or they're going to make a lot of aggression to make somebody flee. So that's sort of the change there. And, and similarly, I grew up in northern New England, and moose had come into northern New England in high density in the 1980s and the 1990s. And still to this day in northern New England, you probably have 2 or 3 fatalities a year when vehicles strike moose, usually at dusk or at night. And the difference even where the predominance of that happening is more than even with deer, hitting deer here in Massachusetts, is that moose, their eyes are brown like a lot of people's, and they don't reflect light the way that deer will. And they're often been in the mud to try to just coat themselves to protect themselves against the mosquitoes, and they're really difficult to see. And so one of the things that's happened is that you've had all kinds of driver education in northern New England to be aware of the fact that it's like when you're likely to hit a moose, or you slow down. You know, you realize that you're on certain roads. If I'm on the Kangamangas Highway cutting across the White Mountains and it's dusk, I know I'll probably drop my speed 10 or 15 miles an hour. I'll know in some cases if I'm in Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, I may not even, if I'm going to go get a gallon of milk, I may not do it, an hour right after dark
Sure.
because it's so difficult to see. In this case,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. In this case, I think the big thing that that we've seen is, there's been a lot of new messages that have gone out to make people more aware, which is like, just the fact it's like if you see seals in the water, you probably should. If you want to reduce the risk, the remote likelihood that you could be mistaken for prey, is don't swim where there are seals in the water. A big, probably the other thing that's really important to keep in mind, and it does relate to this weekend's or last weekend's death, is that worldwide 60% of the shark fatalities and attacks occur on people who are on some type of board or some type of flotation device. So whether that's a surfboard or a boogie board, or whether that's a paddle board, what commonly happens, there are two dynamics that happen. One is that for the shark, when he's coming from down below, the silhouette of the board often is very closely resembles the size and the shape of, let's say, a seal, or if you're on the West Coast, a sea lion on the surface. So there are a lot of mistaken identity hits. But the other part of it is that white sharks, when they're hunting seals, they're generally right they're in between, let's say, sandbars or at the first significant drop-off. And they're looking for a young seal to make a mistake in terms of going there. So if you're boogie boarding, or you're basically in what we call the surf zone. So it's the kind of thing, if you are boogie boarding or you're surfing, you are in that really dangerous territory where that's where the sharks are looking to prey on animals. And so it's the kind of thing, most people in the surf community are very aware of that risk. And some of them embrace it, and that's part of the sport to them.
Sure.
Where it's the kind of thing, as a young man, I was a big rock climber, and I climbed a lot of, big faces up in the White Mountains, Cathedral Ledge or Cannon Cliffs. And it was the kind of thing I understood that what I was doing, I had a certain level of risk I was assuming with it. I actually could do it pretty safely overall, but it was the kind of thing, there was still some risk that I couldn't manage when I'm out there. And so you've got that. On the other side, it doesn't minimize that we need to still do a better job about potentially reducing that risk. So number one is people can make better choices, or not so much they can still engage in an activity, but they need to be informed about what they're doing. But, a lot of times surfers, even on the Sunday after, Arthur Medici was killed, there were surfers out there, but those surfers also had somebody at a high point with binoculars checking for sharks.
Sure.
Not a guaranteed way that you're not going to have sharks in there, but they're assuming some of the responsibility on that. The other thing that happens is that, we can get better detection out there, both in terms of potential drone technology that we've got out there, more sharks that are tagged with particularly sensors that are going to inform local officials when there are sharks in close proximity. There's a lot of things that can still be done to better reduce the risk for everybody who's using the beach.
Tony, that's all the time we have. Thanks very much for talking with us about this problem. Obviously, there is a lot more to learn about sharks and about what we can all do. Folks on Cape Cod are planning a meeting in the near future to discuss the problem because they are concerned about things like economic impact and all of that, and safety, which is really the number one concern. Tony, thanks very much.
Thank you for inviting me, Jim.
Tony Lacasse of the New England Aquarium. I sense there'll be a lot more talking about this problem in the months to come. Don't go away. Townsquare Sunday returns in just a moment.